a federal court has ruled the government's use of the Emergencies Act during the convoy protests back in 2022 was not justified. The CBC's Karina Roman is live in Ottawa. And Karina, you've been reading over the decision, which runs nearly 200 pages. So we're just all kind of getting our heads into it. But so far, what have you been able to glean from it?
Okay, so let's just go over the language that the judge used in terms of his conclusion, saying, I have concluded that the decision to issue the proclamation, that would be the invoking of the Emergencies Act, does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility, and was not justified in relation to the relevant factual and legal constraints that were required to be taken into consideration. Now, obviously, that is news that he found very differently than the public inquiry, the Rouleau Commission, which found the government was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act, Andrew. And of course, you know, in this 190 plus pages, there are many, many reasons, and he goes over the arguments of both sides just to give people a sense of what parts of the charter we're talking about. We're talking about Section 2B, which is the freedom of expression, Section 8, which is search and seizure. He did not find that there was any infringement on the right to assembly, because even though, of course, you know, people were restricted in where they were allowed to go, that is, you know, allowed. Those are reasonable limits. But in terms of freedom of expression and search and seizure, that's where he found there were infringements. And in terms of the justifiability, Andrew, you'll recall that there was a lot of talk about the CSIS definition of a national threat to security. And what's interesting is the judge found it doesn't actually matter whether or not CSIS said that there was a national security threat or not. I mean, that should be given weight, that, you know, it's something to actually consider, but it's not the sole reason to invoke it. So you might say, well, then why did he say they were unjustified? And again, Andrew, I've only read parts of it, but from what I gather, it really comes down to this was not a national emergency, that the police and the provincial authorities in different regions, whether we're talking about Alberta and Coutts or whether we're talking about Quebec or Windsor, they were able to deal with the problem at hand. What really the problem was Ottawa. And that means it wasn't a national emergency. And he talks as well about some of the financial penalties they brought in terms of seizing and freezing bank accounts, because that affected people beyond just the people they were trying to affect. That itself was an overstep. But he does say that the cabinet had the right and the power to invoke in terms of that is within their power, but they did not have the justification. It was an unreasonable move based on all the evidence before him.
That's really interesting, Karina, that the cabinet had the right to do this, but that this was an unreasonable invocation of the Emergencies Act. We should mention that our Kate McKenna, our colleague, says that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is going to be putting out a statement in the next few minutes, and they're one of the groups that brought this forward to a federal court. So can you give us that context?
Well, yeah, so they obviously, and in fact, the judge praised them and said this shows why it's important to have these public interest litigants to bring these cases forward. But what's interesting as well in part of his judgment is he talks about how if he had been at the table, you know, making the decisions, that he does recognize that hindsight is 2020, and that in the moment, he may have even been persuaded that this was necessary, but that in the light of day, when you actually get to hear all the evidence and see what the applicants, in this case, the Civil Liberties Association, but others as well, that then you get to see, well, actually, maybe it wasn't. And so he does say there is a recognition of this benefit of hindsight and time to actually go through it. But in the moment, you might be seized with the sense of urgency that, you know, calmer heads prevail as time goes on, and in terms of looking back on what was really going on. So that's interesting. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear, Andrew, that there probably is going to be an appeal of this. So this is not the end of that. It would be hard to see the government not appealing this. So it probably goes on to the next level, which I believe is the Federal Court of Appeal. And of course, this lands on the wrapping up of the cabinet retreat in Montreal. So I'm pretty sure we're also going to hear from cabinet ministers on this as well.
Well, if you don't hear from them, I'm pretty sure reporters will ask them about it. But Karina, let's talk a little bit about that, because I'm trying to kind of understand the consequence. I mean, I guess there could be political consequences, obviously, but are there other kinds of potential consequences for the government, given that a federal court has ruled that they had the right to do this, but it was unreasonable?
From what I can tell, no, the applicants did not ask for any remedies. So there doesn't seem to be a penalty. That the remedy that they were looking for was a declaration that this was unjustified, unreasonable, and that is what they got today. So interesting, they didn't ask for costs, from what I can tell. So it does seem like this is more a political ramification for the government than anything else. And, you know, because it's not the final court, because it will go on, that does give the government some room to perhaps say they disagree with this ruling, or that at least they need to, like the rest of us, take some time to read it before they go forward and decide. But considering this, especially considering the parties that were involved in this protest, and what that has meant for this particular government in terms of its brand, its messaging, the whole thing about, you know, where the opposition was more supportive of the convoy and what it was trying to say, and that these people are just trying to express themselves. It certainly then feeds into that narrative that the opposition has tried to push, that the government overreached, overstepped. And this obviously a blow to the government's argument that no, this was very much needed. So it's definitely something we're still trying to parse.